Welcome to this session. Anybody else having coffee, you're more than welcome to come over, even just for the rest. We're going to talk about learning has changed, have you? So just to introduce myself initially, and then we'll introduce our panel. My name is Gavin Woods. We're from the Ormo Road's best kept secret, Aurion Learning. We're a digital learning company working with organisations throughout the UK and Ireland and right around the world. So everybody from Belfast City Council to Disney and everybody in between. Particularly strong in healthcare, government organisations as well. So on the panel today, I'll let them introduce themselves. But first up, we have John Curran.
Hello, everybody. I'm, well, technically a digital learning architect. So ideally, I help clients design spaces in which learning is effective. I was also ex-chair of the E-Learning Network. Anybody here heard of the E-Learning Network? So that's a great organization for people getting into digital learning. I'm a judge on the E-Learning Awards. And I've done a lot of work in the past with Aurion and some of their amazing clients.
That was a good lead up for you, Jim. Jim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jim. I'm one of the amazing clients that they have. I work for the Northern Ireland Civil Service, senior training consultant, but also manager for the digital learning unit, I suppose.
And Neha.
Hi everyone, I'm Neha Budge. I'm the learning design manager at Aurion Learning, so I work closely with John. I'm responsible for the learning design activities that take place in the team. I come from a long background in e-learning, mostly in the NHS, so it's great to be in Belfast.
Okay, and it's great to be supporting digital DNA. I think it takes somebody to step out and try and get things back to normal. I think we all have talked about the new normal, and it's great to see Simon and the team taking the steps to do that. But let's get started. So the world has been in a terrible state of chassis over the last 18 months, just in case you didn't notice. The fact that it looks like you're sitting in the musical chairs World Championship here is enough to tell us that. And learning's been no exception to that. So we'll maybe start with a question to Jim. Jim, when you cast your mind back 18 months, what was the immediate impact you saw of the pandemic, specifically on learning delivery?
Okay, so we started obviously with go home and let's just work it out after that. Then civil service was primarily classroom delivery, obviously, and then as the curve didn't seem to flatten after 2 weeks, as we were promised, we ended up starting to have to consider how are we going to deliver this training now? We had demands, recruitment and selection. People still needed trained on panels on how to do that. That was our first big webinar. But even then, it was our first foray into webinars, and we're really only, it was a tell session, but it met a need. And of course, then we had a big thing on developing material for the pandemic itself. So we created 2 learning bundles, one on well-being, on how to manage stress and working, that stressful working from home even. And of course, then there was a remote working bundle we had with management of remote working. We had never worked remotely in the civil service, never. It wasn't really done. So now it was a case of how do you manage remotely, how do you work remotely, it's dealing with that stress as well.
So it's fair to say you had this sort of immediate conversion, this sort of survival mode?
Yeah, pretty much so. Like I say, the things that were coming up for well-being and for remote working, initially it was really documents that they could access, given top tips, but then that became, of course, converted into e-learning, converted into videos, things like that. We were lucky in that we've had our digital learning unit from 2013, but trying to get some traction on digital learning was difficult until COVID kicked. And that catapulted us right into the forefront of how are we going to get this learning done.
So Neha, from the supplier side, the designer side, you must have had a very quiet 18 months over the last 18 months?
I would say, yeah, quite the opposite. So I think we saw a lot of demand, certainly with some of our clients, for example, the HSC in the South. So through our platform that we run for them, HSC Land, we were obviously working closely with them to deliver things like COVID vaccination webinars and so on, trying to train GPs and immunizers right across the HSE in the basics of the various types of COVID vaccines. So there was kind of a constant demand for that, and I suppose there still is to an extent because that drive isn't over yet. I think one of the big things that we saw was converting classroom training into remote training instead, so online facilitator-led sessions. So, for example, with the Retirement Planning Council, we had a big project there where they suddenly had to pivot and they had to deliver all of their courses online, and they needed help and support with that. So we had to kind of adapt our usual way of working as well and work closely with them on that. And John, you were facilitating that quite a bit as well, weren't you, with the Retirement Planning Council?
Yes, I mean, I think it was a baptism of fire for pretty much all of us. So our phones never stopped ringing with people saying, you know, you talked to us last year about digital learning, and we sort of were, well, maybe that'll catch on. We need it now by next week. And suddenly there was a mad panic to do everything online. Interestingly, though, what we used to call live online learning, so Zoom, teach me Zoom. And can we deliver our classroom on Zoom? And that for a while that worked. That was like a sticking plaster sort of solution. But ultimately, from our perspective, we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, digital learning is much, much more than delivering your classroom on Zoom. Wow. Death by PowerPoint is death by PowerPoint, whether it's in a room like this or whether it's on Zoom. So I think clients have learned over the last 18 months that there's a lot more to digital learning and learning online than they thought before, but at least they're now engaged in the conversation and they're interested to know, you know, what the best way forward is.
That's a big surge in digital adopters. We run a lot of webinars at Aurion, and normally we get about 80 to 100 organizations at our webinars, all sorts of different learning topics. So when the pandemic hit last year, we ran a 3-webinar series, how to run an effective webinar, how to convert PowerPoint for use online, for online training, and another, I think it was about remote learning activities. Across the 3 webinars in a week, we got 1,500 organizations compared to our normal 100. So it just shows you, I think there was that sort of crisis, that conversion, that survival mode that everybody went into. And our argument is part of that is definitely here to stay. So thinking about that, and maybe come to you, John, first. Conversion of content to digital versus digital transformation of content. What's the difference between those two things? I'll say that again. Conversion of content to digital versus digital transformation of content.
Yeah, that's a tough question. So a simple approach is to take your PowerPoint and do it on Zoom. But ultimately, Zoom, you know, I mean, I like Zoom. We did training on Zoom. But ultimately, it doesn't give you a great learning experience. You miss out some of the things in the classroom. There's other ways people want to learn these ways. So if you really want to do digital learning properly, you have to think about all the different approaches, what we call the channels. I liken it to a bit like a marketing mix. So if you're on Dragon's Den and you want to launch a new product, you don't just have TV ads. You want to do a bit of TV, a bit of social media, a bit of publishing. You want to mix your approach. And I think it's the very, very same with digital learning. You need to think about what works for your audience, what sort of content you're delivering. And if you're delivering something to all your employees, as opposed to maybe a sort of management training program, you need to take a different approach. So for us, there's lots of different technologies to get your head around, but also just some very simple approaches. I'll talk about blended learning. You know, that's a word that's been bandied around for years. I've rarely seen proper blended learning, but I think now for the first time, people recognize the value in doing a mix. You know, some digital, some face-to-face, and some in other ways. And I think it's a case of embracing all those different technologies to develop an effective learning experience.
So webinars, I think, is what a lot of people think of. We'll do an audience poll. Hands up if you've done a webinar or you've been on a webinar in the last 18 months. Okay. Second hand up if you did more webinars in the last 18 months than you did in the previous 18 months. Okay. Now wave both your hands if you're slightly sick of webinars. Yeah. Zoom fatigue. Zoom fatigue is real. Jim, obviously there have been a lot of webinars, lots of different things going on in the civil service. How do you think learners are maybe feeling about webinars now?
I think initially the problem with converting classroom to webinars is people take a 2-day course and created a 2-day webinar. Disaster. It's just so concentrated on that screen, it becomes so tiring. The key is, for me, they need to change it to what do you need to know, what can be blended, exactly what John was talking about, what could be pre-read, what could be exercise afterwards, things like that. Our learners, for the civil service, webinars weren't done that much, you know, so I suppose for us it was a whole new experience. I still think people do struggle with it when it goes over a certain length of time. I think you have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, I think on the webinars, like delivering a webinar is kind of a bit like this. It's a part of a performance, and it can be somewhat draining. So, any thoughts, Neha, for somebody who maybe is doing webinars? You know, they're delivering 3, 4, 5 sessions a week. Like, how can they scale the overall amount of learning that's happening? Because as Jim said, you take a 2-day session, you do it in a 2-hour webinar. You're going to have to do something outside of that session.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to engage with the learners and to give them practical activities as well that they can engage with as part of the learning that they're doing through the webinar. So we talk about extending learning in the work that we do. So you shouldn't just be sitting there in a webinar for an hour. What you should be doing is taking, regular breaks and taking the opportunity to do things like, worksheets, or, there might be job aids that are given out as part of the training that you're delivering, so people can really connect back to their work rather than just sit in a webinar and listen. As was a major tip that I would have is that if you are delivering a webinar, really, you shouldn't be going more than 5 or 6 slides. Really, that's 5 or 6 minutes before going back and engaging with your learners, doing a poll, asking them questions, asking them to go off and do a little activity on their own for 5 minutes, or indeed work in groups or in work with their peers. It's something that we're reflecting on, attending this event today. A big part of attending a face-to-face event is the chat and the banter.
And
if we can
it's
try and
nice to meet.
that.
It's nice for you and John to meet after working together for about 19 months. This is the first time they've met physically, but I think that's the case for a lot of us. So, you're doing webinars, and we're not necessarily bashing webinars, but I think the use of how they're used within a learning mix. I think the days of just talking to people, I think we're all tired of that, and I think learners are expecting a bit more. So maybe moving on, Jim, to thinking about learners and workers, remote workers, but also remote learners. They've seen a big change in their working day. I know some are still coming into civil service offices, but a lot are working remotely. What do you think that flexibility means that they're now actually looking for as learners?
I think it's like all audiences. You're going to get some that like things and some don't. There were some people liked webinars here, a few, and there were some that really disliked them. There are still people, I suppose civil service is a bit of an older generation still, and they are still missing the classroom, I think. But I think people are still looking at flexibility, especially with home responsibilities. So digital learning in any other way, other than having to turn up at a certain time. I think people are still looking for that, a real flexibility.
Is there an argument, John, maybe come to you on this? We saw a lot of training courses. We talked about the two-day course. People were doing e-learning modules in between. But is there a reason why it had to be a 2-day course? You think of a classroom course. Surely that was dominated by the calendar. Like, do we need to rethink how we schedule learning around the new world of work?
Absolutely. I joined, this is show my age now, I joined Rakel Electronics years ago. And when they worked with the marine industry, and I said to them, why are all your courses 5 days? I said, well, we don't want to send somebody home halfway through on a Thursday. So basically, they just took up 5 days with that course. Likewise, people generally have a 1-day or a 2-day course, and that's done as a purely logistical exercise. Look, we're taking people out of the office, we might as well keep them in the classroom for a whole day or 2 days. In practice, of course, what you want to do is to give people a bit of learning before they come up on a face-to-face. So they do, I hate to call it pre-reading, it's not pre-reading. You want to engage them, engage their interest. Maybe they do watch a video, they might do a webinar with some interactivity in the webinar. I will say turn off the slide sharing, turn on the cameras, make sure people are still there, have a discussion, and then maybe they come along and do some sort of face-to-face event. So actually you can mix all these things. I mean, whatever blend works for whatever topic you're working with, and whatever your learners need. And also the final thing then is you can do it over a period of time. So 2 days, it's artificial. Generally you want to give somebody a bit of input, get them to do a bit of practice, and then a bit more input. That'll be a lot more successful than to have to cram everything into a 1-day or 2-day course. They go back to the office and they got an email mountain. So for us, the idea of a learning pathway, which takes place over a period of time, not too long, is a much more effective way of delivering a good learning experience.
So instead of your 2-day classroom course, you could spread that out over say 3 weeks, 4 weeks. There's not necessarily that logistical pressure to get everybody in, out, back to the office.
In fact, it fits people's working schedules better. If you know you can do an hour today, and then an hour on Thursday, and then a 2-hour webinar on next Monday, actually you can work your work around that much more effectively than heading off to somewhere for two whole days and going back to a whole load of chaos.
So we talk now about learning that works at Aurion, not just digital learning, although digital is a big part of what we do. What different kind of things can people do with that classroom time, maybe to what they did previously?
Well, just following on from what John said, probably the best course that I'd been on as a professional, as a learning professional, was one that was spaced out over 4 weeks. It was 6 hours of webinars over 4 weeks with homework in between. So very much what you said, John, about doing a webinar, lots of engagement in that webinar, but spaced learning and picking that up the following week, and actually the facilitator was checking my homework along the way as well. It was actually about learning design, so it was somebody who actually knew about this kind of thing and therefore applied that to the way that courses were run. So I mean, that's certainly one way to go in terms of how we can, try different ways of delivering courses. But it brings into focus the kind of things that we talk about in learning, like spaced learning, micro learning, so a little bit at a time as opposed to a load on one day.
So
and lots of space for
being
practice.
realistic about what learners can actually consume and interpret and actually make practical use out of.
And also adapting to professional life, so actually for me to take an hour and a half out of my week to attend something was much more preferable than me sitting in a classroom for an entire day or 2 days.
So classroom isn't dead, Jim. You mentioned to me the other day that there's still elements of classroom that are here to stay out of necessity, and as well as sort of that connection. What does classroom sort of look like, do you think, going forward within the civil service?
Well, for the civil service, primarily, it seems the way we're working at the minute is if a skill needs to be demonstrated, then it still needs to come into a classroom. So our first aid course, we have a 2-day course. One is a webinar, 1 day a webinar. The next day, in practically showing that you can save somebody's life. Now, personally, I want to know that you know how to do that when you're saving my life. Hopefully it'll not be for a while, but so AED, the defibrillators, first aid. There is another one coming in, and I'm now racking my brains into the classroom, but I can't think what it is. But yeah, if you have a skills demonstration to do, I think the classroom still has its place. But it still can blend. It still can blend until the point that you have to demonstrate.
So if we think about, if the narrative is moving from that survival mode, rather than survive, we now want to thrive. So this idea that, okay, what we did in the short term was sufficient, it was necessary, it wasn't necessarily bad, but if it's losing its luster a little bit for learners potentially, and it's not making best use of flexibility, what does it look like to thrive? Maybe come to yourself, John, initially, to thrive in a digital learning world.
Well, actually, from what Jim said about first aid, that's interesting. I've got a very, very good friend who's a first aid trainer, and he lost all his business when we went through the pandemic, because they were all 2-day. He does an outdoor first aid course for people like skiing, hiking, that sort of stuff. So all of a sudden he lost all his business overnight. So I said to him, why don't you build an online course? He said, we can't do first aid online. I said, well, I've done your first aid course. It's mostly PowerPoint. So I said, you can do those knowledge building elements online, and then the rest you can do in a face-to-face session. He said, well, that's a good idea. He had nothing to do. He downloaded a license of Storyline and built all the little mini modules of the first aid. And then since then, he's now delivering the face-to-face bit. It's transformed his business model. He's got 4 times more customers than he's ever had. And he says, John, it's amazing. I now only do 1 day, whereas I used to do 2. I don't even need to do anything. I just need to let people onto the learning management system. They do their thing. They pass a test. They turn up. I do the face-to-face. Completely transformed. So that's an example where when you start to use the technology and you see what it can do, it'll work differently for everybody, depending on what your requirement is. But when you engage with the technology and the approach, then I think it can really make a big difference to whatever you're trying to achieve.
So maybe
thriving.
Maybe your friends going from being limited by his calendar to really being limited by how many learners actually want to come and do it, and they do it at a time that's
Absolutely, absolutely. And he had an accreditation body to satisfy, but they were happy as long as he did 6 hours face-to-face, they would still accredit the first aid course.
Okay, so maybe open to everybody. What types of content are best suited for the current environment? So there's been this big change. Have we learned anything sort of through the pandemic and looking ahead to the future about the types of content that are going to be prevalent going forward? Maybe come to yourself, Neha, initially.
Yeah, sure. I think our demand for different types of learning experiences hasn't been abated. I mean, if anything, it's increased over the past few months. There's still a strong case for video, and it's sometimes a picture tells 1,000 words, and sometimes a video tells 1,000 words rather than reading a lot of content. So, and I think when we talk about things like skills demonstrations and so on, and those kinds of learning activities, actually video is still very strong as a contender. A lot of things like learning pathways and just different models of learning that allow you to adapt and to change your preferences and to try different things. I mean, that's always still very strong, so yeah.
And what does the content toolbox look like for you, Jim, and your colleagues at the moment?
So at the minute, obviously we have Classroom, we have blending, e-learning, video, webinar, that sort of thing. Yeah, I would suggest video is probably going to be our next driver. Personally, then I think we need to start getting into curated material.
Yeah.
And trying to get people's interest in reading really interesting articles, which piques their interest in learning that we need to provide them.
Yeah, I think it's important for us as sort of HR training, even tech professionals, to think about like, how do we consume things? I don't know about you, but I find it hard to go to bed at night because Netflix keeps on giving you that next episode of the series. It draws you in. So, I think we strangely, maybe pre-pandemic, expected our learners to do all these great things with their own devices, their own world, and then when we brought them into training, we expected them to sit and pay attention for a number of hours. Anything stands out to you, John, in terms of technologies or content?
Yeah, well, the Netflix, I mean, it's a common thing now. We say, this is the Netflix of whatever, of learning. So one big shift I have noticed is that more power to the learners. So in the conventional L&D, people like Jim, not Jim, but tell you what to learn. And that's sort of, well, really? So I think we're seeing much more self-service. So people want to choose what they want to learn. Clearly there are some compliance things they have to learn, but otherwise you want to choose. If you want to be better at influencing, you want to be able to go online and choose something that works for you over whatever time period, whether it's a short course or a longer course. So I think for me there's a lot more learners in control. And for me, platforms that do that give the learners the choice to chain things together to create their own learning and development experience, that's where the future's going.
So a lot of jargon about in e-learning. We have a jargon buster on our website. We talk about things like LMS, which is a learning management system, LXP, a learning experience platform. So I think it's interesting to pick up what you said, Jim, about curated. Because we tend to go to all different sources for our learning. Like I was trying to paint a bathroom ceiling that had been worn away, and you go onto YouTube and you watch a video of somebody to do that, and halfway up the ladder I'm pausing the video and how far did I scrape this back? So very, very practical, as well as we look at things like TED Talks and things like that. So John, it would be amiss if I didn't angle in a particular thing that we're excited about that we've been working on in Aurion. I'm sure everybody will indulge us a little bit. So perhaps you could tell people a little bit about Bycast and why we think it's really well suited for post-pandemic learning.
Yeah, so well, I've come across a lot of learning management systems. I'm sure is anybody here not familiar with what an LMS is? A learning management system. It's normally where you go and get your learning. So sadly, they're very geared up for the admin people, but not very geared up for the learners. So for me, what's really important is a much more sort of Apple-like learner user experience. So this is a new product we're working with. It creates learning pathways which work on your phone really well. It's just a really, really brilliant UI for learners and for content creators. So for me, these sort of tools are going to put learners much more in control. I'm going to make it a much more interesting and more valuable experience for people doing the learning. Obviously, you know, as well, we need to be able to create these things in an easy fashion as well. But for learners, I think that's, you know, where things are going. A much more Apple-like experience for learning online.
So we have an article that has a similar title to today's session on our website. It's aurionlearning.com, and it talks a little bit about Bycast. So there was a survey that came out from Fosway Group. It talks a little bit about the L&D change. I'd suggest to people to check that out. But it talked about the 4 top learning content types for post-pandemic world were video content, curated, blended, and mobile. So it touched on some of the things we're seeing, which to me says is all about flexibility and scalability. Is that what I'll throw this to everybody? Is that what it says to you? That's a very leading question. Do you agree with me?
No, just kidding. Yeah, I think, you know, it'll be different things for different audiences, but basically those tools that make it easier for learners and for the content creators are definitely going to be the tools. You know, what we're loosely calling these days learning experience platforms. So if you do have a horrible LMS in your organization, okay, that really gets in the way of doing learning online, then tell them to buy an LXP. So that will absolutely transform things. I'm sure you've all been on what we used to call Lynda, was LinkedIn Learning, or you've been on Udemy or Masterclass. Anybody seen a new Masterclass where Gordon Ramsay teach you how to cook? You know, all of that stuff. You know, it is like much more a Netflix world. I think that's the world we're going to be heading into.
So if people are probably here today, or the millions listening around the world on the live stream, they're probably at different starting points. So some people will probably be a bit more established, like yourself, Jim. You know, maybe have an infrastructure for digital learning. Some people are probably going, "What was that? LMS? You know, we're not really using digital learning. We're using Zoom." So I'll throw this out to you first, Jim, and then the rest of the panel. What advice would you have as somebody who has embraced digital learning and blended learning? What advice would you have for those who are considering either implementing or refining a learning strategy? Put you on the spot. Let's say the tough one to the end there.
Okay, so I suppose the key to it is finding out what is out there. I think we had a digital learning unit from 2013, and trying to get people to consider it and couldn't do it. We're struggling to do it. But the key was keeping going to these learning technology conferences, seeing what's going on, so that when something like this hit, then we were able to react very quickly. But it's the obvious things. You know, if you're looking to implement digital learning, then you need to talk to your stakeholders. What is it they're actually looking for from learning? What time scales do you have? What budget do you have? It's those things that you need to consider. Obviously, they're the basics. You need to get going with that, and then know what's out there, know what you can do with the resources that you have.
So you're an internal champion, Jim. You won't mind me saying that for digital learning. Is there an opportunity? You know, we hate to be opportunistic about tumultuous events, but is there an opportunity for learning that you've seen over the last 18 months for digital?
Yeah, we couldn't have seen it. A bad situation that it is, it couldn't have come better for the digital learning unit, obviously. It's because everybody then wants digital at that stage. There definitely was opportunities for it. And it allowed people then to really see what digital could give them. Whereas they had pretty much a lot of people write digital off as second class or training done on the cheap. Once you really got seeing it done well, then it was a great launch for us then and for digital learning in the civil service.
So we'll maybe end by extending everybody's learning today. So I'll ask you, Neha and John, one thing that people could do after they leave today when they go back to their organizations, or one site or resource you would recommend that they have a look at?
So I think in terms of one thing they could do is go out and talk to your learners. And, you know, just reflecting on what Jim has said, talk to your stakeholders, but definitely talk to your learners as well, and find out what it is that they really need, what they want, what's missing from the current provision, because I'm sure you have something already in terms of training provision. And also just, you know, work with them to define something that is going to be actually, in the end, usable and useful and practical for them.
Yes, I'd echo that. In fact, I'd ask them, imagine if you had a Netflix of learning, what would it look like in this organization? And listen to what they tell you. Because very surprisingly, a lot of the clients we've worked with who were previously reluctant to do digital learning, and once they were forced into doing it, surprise, surprise, they thought, we'll only do it for a temporary bit, and we'll go back to business as usual once all this pandemic stuff is over. Surprise, surprise, the vast majority of learners in those organizations say, no way, we don't want to go back to that old rubbish. We want to stick with this. So they've realized, actually, we do need to deliver learning that works for our learners and for us.
The way you wrapped that up, John, with the company strapline of learning that works, that was very good. I was going to end with some sort of comment about learning that works. That brings us to an end. We're more than happy to have a chat with anybody. Say aurionlearning.com for the website, or you can join us next week for Bycast week. We're going to be online all week. We've got podcasts, webinars, all sorts of things to find out about this new learning platform, which sort of works for all different sizes of organizations. So thanks for your time. Hopefully you enjoyed the rest and the session.